Deep in the mountains, miles from civilization, David thought he was safe. Then the footprints appeared. David had escaped the chaos of city life for a solitary winter in a remote cabin. No roads, no neighbors, just snow, trees and silence, until something else arrived. One morning, he woke to find footprints in the snow outside his cabin. They circled the structure, dozens of them, barefoot, in the dead of winter. The nearest town was over 50 miles away, and the tracks led only one way, toward his door. David locked every door, every window. He built a fire, trying to ignore the creeping dread. That night, the wind howled, and something tapped against the glass. A whisper carried through the storm. "Let me in." He gripped his rifle, heart pounding. The firelight flickered, casting strange shadows. He peered outside, but the footprints had vanished. Then the whisper came again. From inside the cabin, the candle sputtered. The door creaked open an inch, though he hadn't moved. His breath clouded in the frigid air. A shape loomed in the darkness, shifting, stretching. Not quite human. It smiled. David screamed, fired his gun. The walls shook. The windows shattered. Then, silence. The fire had died. His breath came in short gasps. The cabin was empty, but the door was still ajar. Slowly he reached for it, hesitating. He stepped forward, peering into the dark abyss beyond. Snow swirled in the cold wind, erasing the footprints. Then he heard it again, directly behind him. "I'm already inside." A shadow passed over the dying embers in the fireplace. David turned, but there was nothing there. The next morning, the footprints were back. This time there were more. They led away from the cabin, disappearing into the trees, as if something had walked back into the wilderness, or as if something had taken his place. Weeks later, the rescue team found the cabin empty, the door hanging open. No footprints, no sign of struggle, just one sentence carved into the wood above the fireplace. "Let me in." Some places are never truly empty. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe and turn on notifications, but if you see footprints in the snow, never open the door.
Alone at the edge of the world, Jake thought he was the last man alive. Then the radio crackled. Jake had spent 6 months stationed at an Arctic weather outpost, monitoring data, logging storms, speaking only to himself. It was supposed to be a one-man job, until someone spoke back. The radio had been silent for months. The main station had gone dark, cut off by a blizzard weeks ago. No supply drops, no updates, just the endless white void. Then, the static shifted. "Hello?" The voice was thin, crackling through the distortion. Weak, desperate, but Jake knew the truth. There was no one else left. He answered anyway. "Who is this?" Silence. Then, "Help me." The signal came from the abandoned station 50 miles south, a place left for dead years ago. No crew, no power, no one to call for help. Still, the voice pleaded. Still, the voice called his name. And in the dead of night, his station door clicked open. Jake grabbed his rifle, heart hammering. No footprints in the snow, no sign of entry, just the wind howling outside. The radio sputtered. The voice had changed, closer, clearer. "Come outside, Jake." He turned, pulse racing. The monitor flickered, live security feed from the outpost's entrance. A figure stood there, wrapped in a torn parka, face obscured by frost, watching, waiting. Then, the radio whispered, "I'm already inside." Jake spun around, sweat freezing against his skin. The room felt wrong. Colder, too still. He checked every corner, every shadow. The door was still locked, but the whisper came again, directly behind him. His own voice. The screen on his laptop flickered, displaying lines of frantic text. His own logs, but he hadn't typed them. Entries filled with desperate pleas. "Please let me in. I can't breathe out here." The lights dimmed. His reflection in the frost-covered window didn't move when he did. The camera feed shifted, now showing the inside of his outpost. A figure sat at his desk, hunched over the radio. It looked exactly like him. Jake lunged for the power switch, killing the generator. The station plunged into darkness, the radio cutting off mid-sentence. For a moment, silence. Then, one last whisper in the black. "You should have let me in." They found the station months later. Empty, supplies untouched, the logbooks filled with frantic scrawls of a man begging to be let back in. The radio still played static. And sometimes, a voice still calls for help. Isolation can be deadly. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. But if you ever hear a voice in the static, don't answer. The lighthouse stood alone on the jagged cliffs. For years, it had guided lost ships. But now, something was knocking on the door. Samuel had taken the job for the Solitude. 1 year of peace, maintaining the lighthouse on Black Reef. No people, no distractions, just the sea and the light. Until the night the lamp went out. The generator was working. The oil reserves were full. But the light refused to stay lit. Then came the knocking. It started slow. One knock, then silence. A minute later, another. The wind howled outside. The waves crashed. But the sound was deliberate, rhythmic, and it was coming from inside the tower. Samuel searched every room, every corridor. Nothing. But then, in the dusty logbook of the last keeper, he found a final frantic entry. The sea remembers. The sea takes back. He checked the dates. The log was over 70 years old. The knocking grew louder. The radio crackled to life. A voice whispered through the static. You were never alone. A shadow moved at the base of the stairs. He turned, heart pounding. The lighthouse spiraled downward into darkness. And something was coming up. The door slammed shut. The lantern sputtered. And then Samuel heard it, his own voice. Let me in. His breath caught. He backed away from the door, but the knocking didn't stop. It came from all around him now. Floorboards, walls, even the very air seemed to pulse with it. The lighthouse groaned. The sea beyond the cliffs raged. Then, a second voice joined the first. You took my place. Samuel's mind reeled. The knocking became pounding. The door bowed inward. He grabbed the radio, hands shaking. Static swallowed his pleas for help. The sea howled outside, and with it, voices rose from the depths. Then, the lantern blew out. Darkness swallowed the room. The last thing Samuel saw was his own reflection in the glass of the lighthouse window, but it wasn't moving the way he was. Weeks later, the supply ship arrived. The lighthouse door stood ajar, swinging in the wind. Inside, the lantern remained unlit. Samuel was gone. The logbook lay open to a fresh page. The final entry read, The sea remembers. The sea takes back. Isolation can drive a man mad. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. But if you hear knocking in the night, don't answer. The abandoned mine was supposed to be empty, but deep underground, Matthew heard someone calling his name. Matthew had always loved exploring forgotten places. When he found an old map leading to a collapsed silver mine in the Nevada desert, he couldn't resist. He should have. The entrance was barely a hole in the earth, hidden beneath shifting sands. He crawled inside, his flashlight casting jagged shadows across the walls. Then the wind stopped, and the first voice whispered, Matthew. He spun, heart pounding. The tunnel stretched into darkness, empty. His own breath echoed too loudly. Then he heard it again, closer. Matthew, come see. The walls felt too tight. The deeper he went, the less his flashlight seemed to cut through the dark. The air smelled of damp earth and something old. He turned to leave. The passage behind him was gone. Panic surged through him. His footsteps quickened, but the walls kept narrowing. The whispering grew louder, voices overlapping. Then, up ahead, a flickering glow. A lantern. A man stood in the tunnel, back turned, unmoving. Matthew reached out, and the man turned. There was no face. The lantern went out. His breathing was ragged. He pressed himself against the tunnel wall, forcing himself to think. The whispering was all around him now, seeping from the very rock itself. He fumbled for his phone. No signal. The flashlight flickered. Then, a sound, distant, rhythmic, the scrape of something dragging along stone. The voice returned, now impossibly close. "Come see." A hand gripped his shoulder. He screamed. Darkness swallowed him. When Matthew opened his eyes, he was lying on damp rock. The mine was silent. For a moment, he thought he had imagined everything. Then he saw them, figures, barely visible, standing at the edges of his vision, not moving, not breathing, watching. He scrambled to his feet. The tunnel ahead yawned open, stretching deeper into the earth. Behind him, the passage had vanished entirely. There was only stone. A whisper slid through the dark. "You came too far." Matthew turned wildly, searching for an exit. The figures didn't move, but somehow they felt closer. Then one stepped forward, its limbs twisted, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. When it spoke, its voice layered over itself, as if many mouths were speaking at once. "Now you stay." Matthew ran. He sprinted blindly through the tunnels, the flashlight bouncing wildly in his grip. The whispers followed him, growing louder, merging into a chorus of unintelligible voices. Then, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. The walls were covered in symbols, carvings so old they seemed worn by time itself. And in the center of the chamber, a pit gaped like an open wound in the earth. Something moved within it. A deep, guttural sound rose from below, something ancient waking from slumber. Matthew staggered back, heart hammering. The figures had followed him, surrounding the chamber's edge. Their mouths opened in unison. A voice, his voice, spoke from the pit. "Come see." The ground trembled. The air turned thick, suffocating. The pit yawned wider. Matthew took a step back and felt hands seize his ankles. He was dragged down. Weeks later, a search team found his backpack at the entrance. No footprints leading inside, no signs of disturbance, just his voice, sometimes drifting on the wind. "Come see." Some places are better left forgotten. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. But if you hear a voice calling your name, never follow it.